In 1975, Paula Darcy was in a terrible car accident which took the life of her young husband and daughter. She was pregnant at the time of the accident and gave birth to another daughter 6 months later. One might ask how one survives that kind of trauma and still finds joy in life. How does a person like Paula relate to the responsorial psalm that was so beautifully sung by Talon? Let all the earth cry out to God with joy. Well, Paula is a writer. She tells us her story in a book called Waking Up to This Day. When she lost her family, she tells us that she began to question what really does matter in life. She had to start over through her horrendous grief, and she realized that there is a powerful source in each one of us that gives us the strength to begin again. She calls it, like many of us do, the soul. But she tells us that in order to begin again, one has to give up on life being a certain way. You have to live on life's terms and not our own, she says. Now, the author of the second reading tells us that we should always be ready to give an explanation to anyone as to the reason for our hope. And Jesus in John's Gospel tells us he will never leave us orphans. Those are wonderful, pious words, but for those in crisis, often hard to take in. I'm sure those are hard words for the people of Joplin, Missouri these days. But Paula reminds us in her writings that one has to sit with one's pain and slowly and painstakingly allow that strength that she writes about to come to the surface. The strength that we call soul, or the strength that we call grace. That one has to sit with one's pain and experience this God who says we will never be abandoned, experience this God in a totally new and different way because of the crisis that we went through. What Paula Darcy realized through her own dark night of the soul is that she could experience joy again, but only by living in the present moment. She writes, "There is only this day. This is where life takes place. The day in front of me is life. And deep inside each of us is the strength and grace and hope to live it in spite of its challenges." Priscilla Gilman is a New York City writer. She grew up in New York among artists. She's a dreamer. She had amazing romantic expectations about the children that she would have. She believed and dreamed her children would be imaginative and intrepid and playful, sources of refreshing honesty, authenticity, and meaning. But when she took her son to enroll him in nursery school, the teachers told her that Benjamin suffered from a syndrome called hyperalexia. It's a high-functioning form of autism or Asperger's. She and her husband went into therapy. It was an extremely difficult time of lost hopes and lost dreams. Their marriage eventually broke up. But 9 years after the discovery of Benj's hyperalexia, Priscilla writes this: "My two boys are very different from what I'd expected my children would be like. And my life is so much richer and more satisfying than I could ever have possibly imagined. Benj has put me in touch with my deepest sense of what's truly meaningful. There have been no easy solutions to the problems Benj and I have faced, And I'm sure there are obstacles and hurdles I can't even envision yet. What I do have is an abiding faith that we can ride out anything that's thrown at us. In one of the wonderful ironies of my experience, little, controlling, rigid Benj has helped me to let go of my desire to follow a predetermined path and taught me how to surrender. Benj has taught me so much more than any professor or class. While initially he seemed to contradict my romantic ideas of childhood and parenting, he defied and rebuffed every expectation I had. Ultimately, he has reaffirmed in a deeper and truer way my romantic ideals. And then she quotes from Wordsworth, The Sparrow's Nest, about Benj. He gives me eyes, he gave me ears, and humble cares and delicate fears, a heart, a fountain of sweet tears, and love and thought and joy. She tells us this story in a very interesting titled book called The Anti-Romantic Child, a story of unexpected joy. Nigel Marsh is one of Australia's most outstanding writers and commentators. You might be familiar with him. A couple of the books that he wrote. The first one was Fat, 40, and Fired. And the next one he wrote was Overworked and Underpaid. Might make maybe people relate to those two. But he's a super busy corporate kind of person who found that his life was so busy that he needed to take time off to figure out how to put some balance back in his life because he had no joy. And he gives a talk on the website that's called TED, T-E-D. It's an amazing website with some wonderful talks on it. And he gives a talk about finding balance in your lives. And he makes the point that thousands of people live lives of screaming desperation with hours at work to buy things they don't need to impress people they don't like. But then he tells a wonderful personal story. He was a busy business person, worked till 7 or 8 o'clock at night, and one day his wife called him and said, "I'm sorry, but you're going to have to leave work early and pick up our little boy at school." So of course he did. He went out and got the little boy, the 5-year-old, took him for a walk in the park. Then they walked down to the pizza shop and they had a pizza. Then they walked home and he bathed him and read him a story and tucked him into bed. And as he was leaving the bedroom just to turn the light off, the little boy sits up in his bed and says, "Dad, that was the greatest day in my whole life, ever." And Nigel just kind of looked at him. And he tells us in the story, he says, "I didn't do anything. I didn't buy him an iPad. I didn't take him to Disneyland." And he discovered where he could find true joy in his life, in the simplest things. Paula Darcy and Priscilla Gilman and Nigel Marsh have found that in the midst of crisis and disappointments and lost dreams and the chaos of corporate life, that they are still able, with the psalmist, to cry out to God with joy because they discovered something most important. They discovered a strength deep in their souls to live in the present moment and to enjoy the simplest experiences of life.